just going to walk you through, just like we did with epithelial tissue, I'm going to walk you through our types of connective tissue, and I'll talk about how we classify connective tissues. Just all of them have the same sort of classifications, how we can identify them. So we find connective tissue basically throughout the entire body, right? Its job is to connect things. So it is the most abundant tissue we have. It's widely distributed. And there are four main classes: connective tissue proper, cartilage, bone, and blood. So connective tissue proper would be things like tendons and ligaments, right? This is just an example. Cartilage, bone, and blood. Which of these four things is not like the other?
Blood.
Yes, blood, right? So a lot of times, and you probably, if you've read your book, you may have seen this in your textbook, blood is sort of an atypical connective tissue, right? Think tendons. These are really tough. Like if you've ever cooked chicken, you know the white stuff, the white tendons, sometimes you'll get those out of like, if you've bought chicken tenders. They're really, really tough. They're slimy and tough and hard to pull. Cartilage is super tough. Bone is super tough. And then you have blood, which is a liquid. Just doesn't really fit with the others. However, I'm going to argue with you that blood is actually the best connective tissue of all. Because if we think about the function of connective tissue, it's to connect things together. And blood definitely connects everything in your body together, right? So these are all connective tissues, even though we know blood is a little atypical, right? So here are some of the functions of our connective tissues. They all bind and support. So bone and cartilage, these are great at binding and supporting things together. They give your body a framework. All of our connective tissues provide protection, right? Bone is very protective, right? Around your soft nervous tissue, you've got cranial bones. Cartilage, again, you've got coastal cartilage in your ribs, which is helping to provide that bony thorax and that protection around your heart and lungs. Even fat is a connective tissue that is very protective. It provides insulation and protection. Another one is insulation, and that's fat. And then the last one, transportation. The only one that provides transportation is going to be blood. It's going to transport things like oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients, and wastes. So then if blood is so atypical, like if it doesn't really perform the same functions of your other connective tissues, if it doesn't really look and feel like your other connective tissues, why is it classified as a connective tissue? I'm going to star this slide because I'm definitely going to ask you a question about this on your exam. All of your connective tissues, all four types of connective tissues, are classified as connective tissues because they have a common embryonic origin. They all come from an embryonic tissue called mesenchyme. Oops, sorry, I don't know why my pen connects things together sometimes. So what you're looking at in this picture is essentially a very young 16-day old embryo. So how did we get to this embryo here, this big ball of cells? You start with an egg and a sperm. Right? The egg is actually the largest cell in the body. The sperm is the smallest. So when the sperm fertilizes the egg, you get a cell with a full complement of chromosomes, 46 chromosomes. That cell then goes through mitosis and makes identical copies of itself over time and creates a big ball of cells, right? And those are called embryonic stem cells. So that's what we're looking at here. We're looking at this big ball of cells. These cells haven't really differentiated yet, right? They haven't become bones and muscles and skin, and they haven't become what they're going to be yet. But at around 16 days, what we start to see is that that big ball of cells, the cells are sort of striated. And we have these three layers. In blue is an ectoderm, And we know that these layers of cells in the ectoderm, they're going to give rise to things like nervous tissue. We know in yellow, that's the endoderm. That's going to give rise to things like epithelial tissue. And then in red, in the middle, that's our mesoderm. And that is going to give rise to all of our connective tissues. And so that's why we call that the mesenchyme. We say all connective tissue comes from that middle layer called the mesenchyme. Okay? So that's why blood is also a connective tissue. It's coming from the mesenchyme, middle layer. So let's talk about some characteristics of connective tissue. It is very different from epithelial tissue. One thing that makes it really different is that, remember I told you epithelium does not have a blood supply, and connective tissue can. It actually has varying degrees of varying degrees of vascularity. So you might have some connective tissue that is avascular. Remember, no blood supply. A means not. So an example might be things like cartilage, right? People who have damaged the cartilage in their knees, a lot of times it's really slow to heal, if it ever heals at all, because there's really no blood supply to your cartilage. But then we have other connective tissues like bone that have a fabulous blood supply, right? You break a bone, even if it's a big bone like your femur, it can heal within a matter of weeks because it has a wonderful blood supply. So connective tissues can have no blood supply or a great blood supply. Just depends on which one we're looking at. One other thing that's very different about connective tissue compared to your epithelial tissue is that connective tissue is not just a bunch of cells. There's a lot of non-living extracellular stuff. We call it extracellular matrix. So when we look at connective tissues under the microscope, you're going to see a lot of other stuff. You'll see some nuclei in there where you can see the cells, but then you're going to see a lot of fibers and a lot of liquid in there. And it's that kind of stuff that gives your connective tissue certain characteristics. Like for example, you have different kinds of cartilage. Like the cartilage that's in your nose and your ears allows your ears to wiggle. This has a fiber in it called an elastic fiber, and it gives it the structure that lets it be more movable and elastic. Whereas the cartilage that's found at the ends of your bones, right? If you've ever eaten a chicken wing, and you get all the way to the bone, that really hard white stuff at the end of the bone that's real slick, that's a different kind of cartilage. That's not nearly the same. It doesn't have the same characteristics as what's in your nose or your ears, right? So it's all of this extracellular stuff that actually gives the structure a lot of its characteristics. So when we talk about our connective tissues, right? So here are some structural elements of your connective tissues. So one thing that we find is that all connective tissues have something called a ground substance. A ground substance is basically the liquid that we find in the tissue. We also have in our connective tissues fibers. And the fibers look exactly what they sound like they would look like. They look like strings. We have different kinds. We have collagen, elastic, or reticular fibers. These two things together make up your extracellular matrix. And then the other thing that you'll find in your connective tissue are the cells. That's the third thing. Okay, so fibers and ground substance together make up the extracellular matrix. And then we have cells. And the cells are going to vary based on the type of tissue we're looking at. So this is a great example. This is just a picture from your book. And it is showing how we have, you can see in the background, there's a lot of liquid in here. There's all these fibers running every which way. That's all the extracellular matrix. And then you can see the cells, right? Here's a cell, and here's a cell, and here's the cell. But they're kind of scattered. They're not jam-packed like epithelial tissue. Now, what we find is that a lot of times, I'm going to walk you through our ground substance and our fibers. I'm going to walk you through the extracellular matrix. The ground substance is the liquid stuff, and this is sort of like a sieve. It lets nutrients pass through that tissue. And so the ground substance is made obviously of a fluid. We call it an interstitial fluid. The term interstitial just means tissue. In the fluid, we also have something called adhesion proteins. Think of the word adhesion, right? It means to adhere to. It is like glue. It sticks everything together. And then lastly, in our ground substance, we have something called proteoglycans. Proteoglycans are something called glycosaminoglycans. A lot of times in your book, they'll call them GAGs for short. So let me see if I can explain these in a way that makes sense. I drew a little proteoglycan down at the bottom. So there's a red line with some little green, they look like bottle brushes coming off. So proteoglycan would be the red line. Glycosaminoglycans are little green structures that look like sponges or bottle brushes. The more of those little green glycosaminoglycans that you find on this structure, the more water you can trap. So the more viscous or liquidy the ground substance will be. So the less gags you have on a proteoglycan, the less water you can trap, and the more stiff the ground substance will be. So an example might be cartilage. The ground substance in cartilage has proteoglycans, and it has a certain number of gags in it. So cartilage does have some flexibility to it. Whereas the proteoglycans that are in bone, those have a lot less gags, can't trap as much water, so bone is not nearly as flexible. It's not as liquidy as cartilage is, okay? So that's the role of a proteoglycan. It helps to trap the water, and it can make your ground substance more liquidy or more stiff, okay, depending on the number of gags. Now we also have, in our extracellular matrix, we have fibers. Depending on which connective tissue we're looking at, will determine which kind of fiber we have. So collagen fibers, not always, but most of the time, under a microscope, these will look very thick and pink in color. Collagen fibers are the toughest, strongest fiber that we have. They are cross-linking fibers. They are stronger than steel. So if we take a piece of steel that's the same diameter as a piece of collagen, collagen is 1,000 times stronger than that piece of steel. So they are very, very strong. So they provide a lot of strength to a tissue when you have them. They also have the ability to absorb a lot of water, okay? Elastic fibers, not always, but most of the time, these are really skinny, they're thin, and they're really dark in color under the microscope. So a lot of times they might be black or like a navy blue, and they're real skinny. These are long coiled fibers, and they are just like what they sound like they are. They are elasticy, they're very stretchy. And then lastly are reticular fibers. And a lot of times these are thick and dark under the microscope. These are very similar to collagen fibers. They're just a little more delicate. Okay. And then the last thing that we find in our connective tissue are cells. So cells of connective tissue can be found in two forms. One is an immature form we call a blast. The other is a mature cell that's called a site. So remember, we have four kinds of connective tissues. We have connective tissue proper, like tendons and ligaments. And in connective tissue proper, you would have a type of cell called a fibroblast or a fibrocyte. The blast, the immature cell, I always think of these as the babies. So I always joked before I had my child, I joked that, I'm going to have a house full of kids because then they can help clean and like cut the grass and do stuff. If y'all have kids, you know that that is not what happens. But, I always think of these young cells as like the workhorses, right? They're going to do all the work. And that's true. Fibroblasts actually make the tissue. So a fibroblast cell sort of puts this tissue around and it's making the tissue. And once it's done its job and it's made tissue all the way around itself, it now becomes a mature cell called a site. It grows up, right? So you have a fibroblast or a fibrocyte in connective tissue proper. In cartilage, we have chondroblasts or chondrocytes. Now remember in chapter 1, when we talked about our abdominopelvic regions, like our hypochondriac regions, remember chondro means cartilage. So chondroblast literally means cartilage cell. Chondrocyte, cartilage cell. Okay, and the difference is that the blast is making the tissue. Once the tissue's been made, it becomes a site. Same thing with osteoblasts and osteocytes. Osteo means bone, so that should be easy for you to remember that that's in bone. And again, you know, blood is atypical, so it doesn't follow the blast site rule. So for the immature blood cells, we have what are called hematopoietic stem cells. Hematopoietic stem cells can become any kind of blood cell. They can become red blood cells or any kind of white blood cell. Okay, and once they're mature, they're a blood cell. Now, other cells that we might find in our connective tissues would be things like white blood cells, plasma cells, macrophages, mast cells. All of those are involved in immunity. So, if you see a type of connective tissue, and maybe I tell you, here's a connective tissue that has fibrocytes in it, and mast cells, macrophages, white blood cells, plasma cells, what's the function of that tissue? It's going to be immunity. Okay, if it's got all these immune system cells, its big function will be immunity. So this is an image from your book. Now this image that I'm using here, this is, I think it's 2 editions removed. I have the current edition, I have that picture a little later, a couple slides later, but I have left this one in your notes because I really like this one. I'm sad that they took this one away. This image is great for connective tissues. I think this is a great place when you're trying to study and kind of get your mind wrapped around connective tissues. This is a great place to start. Because if we start at the top, you can see that we've got mesenchyme. Remember, all connective tissues come from that embryonic tissue called mesenchyme. And then it moves into your cells, right? Fibroblasts. Fibroblasts turn into fibrocytes, and those form connective tissue proper. We can see chondroblasts turn into chondrocytes. Those form cartilage. Osteoblasts turn into osteocytes, which make bone. Hematopoietic stem cells turn into blood cells, and they make blood. And so this is great because it's showing you from the cells at the very beginning, if a mesenchymal cell differentiates and becomes an osteoblast, for example, you know you're going to get bone. Then it also goes through all the subclasses. Now we haven't gone through this yet, but this is going to go through all of the different subclasses for connective tissue proper, all the different types of cartilage, the bone, and your blood. So this is a great place when you're studying to kind of start, just to get your mind wrapped around all the subclasses and the types of cells that each connective tissue has. So before we go into our connective tissues, and we only have about 10 minutes left for lecture this morning, but before we go through connective tissues, I do want to tell you that there are a lot of connective tissues. Like, here's all the connective tissues that we'll go through. There's a ton of them, and all of them have a living component, so they all have cells. But they all have that extracellular matrix, the ground substance and the fibers. And so the type of connective tissue that you are looking at, whether it is in lab or in the lecture, the type of tissue you're looking at, if it's connective, is going to depend on the 3 things listed. And the very first thing is cell type. Cell type will tell you a lot. If you know that the type of cell in that tissue is an osteocyte, then you know you're looking at bone. If you know that the type of cell, if I tell you, hey, this tissue has fibrocytes in it, you know it's a connective tissue proper. Or this tissue has chondrocytes, you know it's cartilage. So the cell type will tell you a lot about the tissue. The second is fiber type. Let's say I tell you, hey, this tissue has chondrocytes in it. and a lot of elastic fibers. Well, then you know chondrocytes are found in cartilage, and one type of cartilage is called elastic cartilage. It has tons of elastic fibers in it. So there you know what kind of tissue you're looking at. So just be aware, especially when you get to the exam, be aware of what kind of information I'm giving you. Cell type and fiber type tell you a lot when it comes to connective tissues. And then also the amount. One of the types of tissues, like connective tissue proper, we classify into loose and dense. So the amount of fibers that you have, how jam-packed everything is, will tell you a lot. So here's our connective tissues that we'll walk through. The first one that we'll do these on Wednesday, is connective tissue proper. So we have, remember these are things like ligaments and tendons. So connective tissue proper is divided into a loose and a dense connective tissue proper. We'll also go through our 3 types of cartilage on Wednesday. We'll talk about our bone and our blood. Okay, so those are our connective tissues that we will walk through. We have a few minutes. I may go ahead and start into our loose connective tissues, just so I make sure that we finish chapter 4 by Wednesday. Does anybody have any questions so far? Y'all are very quiet. Everybody good?
Yes.
Okay. So our loose connective tissue, like areolar connective tissue, is one. I love the name of this. Areolar tells you right there in the name, it's airy. It's very spread out. It's a loose tissue. So this type of connective tissue proper, it has all 3 fibers in it. So it has collagen, elastic, and reticular. So all 3 fibers are here. The type of cell is a fibroblast, because remember, we're dealing with connective tissue proper. But it also has macrophages, mast cells, white blood cells. So you know that the function of this tissue is immunity. Where do we find it? Everywhere. If its function is immunity, we're going to find it pretty much everywhere. Where we find areolar tissue is directly underneath our skin. So if you were to take your skin and kind of peel off that first layer, that epidermis, right underneath that epithelial tissue, you have areolar tissue. So now think about where we find it. All over the body. That's great, because if you get a cut and something's able to make it through your skin, through your epidermis, through that epithelial tissue, you've got areolar tissue with white blood cells and macrophages and mast cells that are there ready to fight the infection. So we have it all over the body. It does have a lot of tissue fluid in it. And if it gets damaged, it'll actually soak up more fluid and lead to swelling, which we call edema. And so this is why a lot of times, if you have ever noticed, if you get a cut, if you feel the cut, a lot of times the edges feel real swollen. That's because of that underlying areolar tissue. It's soaked up a lot of fluid. This is an image of areolar tissue. So again, remember, I've been talking about how connective tissue is not just cells, right? We can see the fibroblast nuclei sort of spread out in here. But now what you see are a lot of fibers. The big, thick pink ones, those are collagen. And the skinny little black ones, those are elastic fibers. Okay, and then you can see all the white space. That's just ground substance. This is why we call this areolar tissue, right? It's very spread out. Another loose connective tissue that I'm going to walk you through is adipose tissue. This just means fat. So this is fat tissue. This has a matrix that's really similar to areolar, but the cells are a little more packed together. And the type of cell is very specialized. Instead of calling it fibroblasts, that's what they are, we're still connective tissue proper, we give them a special name. Because if we think about a cell, right, normally like an animal cell, it has a nucleus in the middle and it has all these organelles all over the place. In a cell that's in fat tissue, Normal animal cells have little vesicles that store stuff. And when we're looking at fat tissue, fat cells have a vesicle in them storing fat, and that vesicle takes up almost the entire space of the cell. And that means all the organelles kind of get mushed to the outside, like the nucleus is kind of mushed to the outside. So instead of just calling these fibroblasts, because they look a little different with that big drop of fat in them, we call them adipocytes. And their big function is just the function of fat. They store food, they insulate, they support, and they protect your body. So that is the big function of your fat tissue. We pretty much find it everywhere. It is under your skin. It's great for protection. We find it around really active organs like the kidneys have fat around them, not only because they're storing nutrients for your kidneys, but also they're protecting your kidneys. We find it in the front of your abdomen. Remember the greater omentum that y'all had to identify in lab last week? That's a layer of fat. It's nice and protective. And then in some of our reproductive organs as well. So here is an image of that. And so you can see here, like this right here, this is an adipocyte. And notice how the inside is all white. That's a big droplet of fat. See how the nucleus got mushed to the outside? See this one here, it's mushed to the outside. So that's how you know you're looking at fat. It looks like a little oil droplet right in there. Okay, so that is adipose tissue, still a loose connective tissue. Now, the last thing I'm going to mention before we're done with lecture today is a little bit about fat in general. Now, this picture of fat is white fat. So this is white adipose tissue. That's what you have in your body. That's typical for an adult. But babies have a type of fat called brown adipose tissue. And what makes it brown in color is mitochondria. Does anybody remember what mitochondria do in your cells? What is their function? They make something.
Protein.
Not protein. ATP, they make energy. So a lot of times people call them the powerhouse of the cell, right? So mitochondria are really dark in color and they make energy. So you're going to have a lot of mitochondria in very active tissues in the body. A great example is like chicken. I like white meat, but some people like dark meat. Just so you know, dark meat is like the wings, right? The legs. These are the more active tissues. It's dark in color because there's more mitochondria in there. So that is what gives the meat a darker color. It's the same thing with adipose tissue. Brown adipose tissue has more mitochondria in it. It's more active. And so we find brown tissue in babies that can't shiver yet to warm up. And so it burns through the fat a lot faster. So in babies, we find it in their shoulder blades, the anterolateral neck, so kind of on the sides of the neck of a baby, and in their abdomen. My little boy, he's 8 now, but he looked like a little beer belly when he was a baby, big old belly. And so this is just helping them to heat their body. And brown adipose tissue burns really fast. There are some people that are thin their whole lives. In fact, there are people that have to eat. They have to try to gain weight. It's hard for them to gain weight. We don't like those people. But for those people who are trying to gain weight, a lot of times what we found is that they actually, as adults, have brown adipose tissue instead of white adipose tissue. So they just burn it really fast. So they're naturally more thin. Okay, but typically we only find it in babies.